Good afternoon. I'm Veronika Füchtner. I'm the chair of German Studies here at Dartmouth College, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this lecture. It's a great pleasure to introduce Frido Mann, who's here together with his wife, Christine Mann, who's sitting over there in the audience. They're both Montgomery Fellows here at Dartmouth. And Frido Mann's lecture is part of a larger event, namely a workshop titled The Mann Family, Lives and Fictions. The Mann family has been called the Windsors of the German intellectual and cultural scene. And indeed, their lives and fictions never cease to fascinate. Particularly the works of Thomas, Heinrich, Klaus, and Erika Mann have significantly shaped German culture and politics of the 20th century. But they also shaped culture and politics on this side of the Atlantic. One might think of Thomas Mann's courageous political stance against Nazi Germany during his exile here in the US and his vision of another Germany. Or one might think of the American critic Susan Sontag, who at age 14 invited herself over for tea to the house of Thomas Mann in Pacific Palisades. In her essay Pilgrimage, she describes the awkward meeting between, as she writes, an embarrassed, fervid, literature-intoxicated child and a god in exile. Mann's many works, such as Death in Venice, The Magic Mountain, or Dr. Faustus, would never cease to exercise a profound hold over Sontag's work through themes such as the politics of language, the fascination of fascism, or the metaphors of illness. And these themes also resonate with the Dartmouth workshop that this lecture is part of. This workshop brings together established scholars with 9 younger scholars. These postdocs, graduate students, lecturers, and assistant professors have submitted article drafts, and we are all discussing them together in the 2 days of the workshop. The workshop participants have come here from all over the US and from as far as Berlin, Vienna, and Hyderabad. And the article drafts have already made clear that the themes and forms of many Mann family writings really do speak to the present moment. They force us to think, and we've had these discussions today, they force us to think about the possibility of queer utopias, about toxic masculinity, or about anti-Semitic tropes. And I want to actually take a moment to have the 9 scholars who came in to submit their articles stand up and give them a round of applause, because they're just amazing. Frido Mann's work is also being discussed, and it is thus very special that he can be present for the conversation. And I do want to thank the many sponsors that made this event possible. I want to thank the Montgomery Fellows program, and particularly Klaus Mielich, the former director, Steve Swain, the current director, and Ellen Henderson, who administered the program. I want to thank the Distinguished Harris Visiting Professorship, which brought Irmela von der Lühe, one of the readers of the workshop, from Berlin, Kathleen Woodburn and Jane Carroll in particular. I want to thank the Department of German Studies and my fantastic colleagues in it, and also Wadine Kunst, administrator, and Lisa Oberberger, who's been helping a lot with the workshop. I want to thank the program in Jewish Studies, and particularly Susanne Heschel, who's here in the audience, for supporting this workshop in many ways. And finally, the arts, oh no, not finally, I'm not done yet. The Arts and Sciences Deanery, particularly Dennis Washburn, who financed Nishant Narayan's ticket from India to come here. And the Thomas Mann House in Pacific Palisades, the house that Susan Sontag visited, that is now a very different place, and they helped fund this workshop also. I want to thank the student assistants for this workshop, Arshi Azizi, Lisa Oberberger, Josh Kalyanos, and Kate Brundage. And a special thanks goes to Kelly Palmer, who administered this workshop and has been just amazing in putting everything together. There will be a reception after the talk outside, and I would like you to stick around and maybe mingle and continue the conversation. And so without further ado, I'll jump in and introduce Frido Mann. I met him through my own work on the mother of Thomas and Heinrich Mann, through Julia Mann, and I have to confess I was first a little bit hesitant about meeting him because as scholars working on famous writers, if you ever have dealt with families of famous writers, can be a difficult relationship. And I was so happy that that was not the case. And Frido Mann has been an amazingly generous and welcoming and open interlocutor and is very involved in the scholarship on his family and on himself. Frido Mann is accomplished in many fields. Firstly, he studied music, wrote compositions, and played the piano. He studied theology and has deeply engaged with questions of religion and spirituality through many of his works. And he studied psychology, which led him to work in psychiatric hospitals and ultimately led to an academic career as a professor for psychology at the University of Münster. He's also a prolific author of many fiction and nonfiction works, among others the play Therésine, about the concentration camp Theresienstadt, which was staged by the great director George Tabori, the novel Brasa, a multi-generational family history, which was inspired by the life of his Brazilian great-grandmother Julia Mann, or his autobiography, Achterbahn, the title of which translates as roller coaster, and it indicates the many unexpected ups and downs and steep curves that his life took. Frido Mann is married to the daughter of the founder of quantum physics, Werner Heisenberg, and Christina and Frido met as students in the 60s while both were studying theology, one Catholic, one Protestant, and as their families merged, they had to negotiate their different family pasts. National Socialism on the one hand and Exile and anti-fascism on the other. Together they co-wrote 2 books on the philosophical and ethical dimensions of quantum physics, and they managed to stay married throughout the process. Frido Mann is the grandson of Thomas Mann, and he was very close to his grandfather. He was born in California and partly grew up in Thomas and Katja Mann's house in Pacific Palisades. He recently returned to this house after the German government bought it 3 years ago and created a new space there for political and cultural dialogue. He returned after many decades as a fellow of the Thomas Mann House. His latest book, The White House of Exile, from last year, narrates this return. It beautifully blends fiction and nonfiction. It delves into past childhood memories, which may sound like fiction, and at the same time imagines very concrete dialogues for the present that actually never happened. It presents a reflection on the fragility of democracy in the 1940s and on the fragility of democracy today. In an age when we experience the return of autocratic leaders, the rise of populist right-wing movements, and a resurgence of deadly anti-Semitic attacks in many countries, including our own. And I want you to help me welcome Frido Mann.
Thank you, Veronica, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. When I today will talk about the dignity, the power, and the importance of open dialogue as a pathway for fortification of democracy, it is a little different than these 8-9 times I had that lecture in the last 5 weeks when I was hopping from city to city, from coast to coast, from the east coast to the heartlands, which were quite different, and the west coast. And because already then I was really interested to go beyond this lecture, have contact with as many as possible high schools and colleges, also too, universities, to have the opportunity to talk with young people, students, scholars, about their situation and their opinion about America and about the world, because I have more and more the feeling now regarding the situation of the young people who go out on the streets more and more, that maybe even they could be, that's a hope, could be our last, maybe our last hope for rescuing our democracy. I'm thinking of them. And that's why I'm so thankful and so glad that now in the last 10 days, and that's why I'm saying it's different now, talking about this, different than weeks before. I, and together with Christine, I had the opportunity to being invited here to Dartmouth College to really talk with a bunch of so many gifted and wonderful young people, students, and not less wonderful teachers and professors here in the last 10 days. There were not only just conversations, there were really dialogues. Really, that kind of dialogue I am wishing that it could be more strengthened more and more again between the two continents which are somehow drifting apart, and also in America, in a fractured country like here. And that's why I'm very glad. I'm thankful for this, and that's why this lecture today seems to be not much more than a theoretical frame of that what I now really have experienced now in these days. And I'm so thankful that I'm hoping that sometime, I don't know, in a year or so, I could even continue these encounters with these people here, with the youngsters here. But it was already at an early age, as a child born in the U.S., that I could feel, well, at first atmospherically and later more and more consciously, the deep democratic conviction of my parents and grandparents. In their American exile, they had soon adopted the basic nature of the American Constitution from 1787, the oldest one in the world. The first words of his preamble had quickly become ingrained. We, the people of the United States. It was not about our nation or our country, not about some super individual, ideologically abstract, hierarchically ordered, stately entity demanding obedience and submission, and even less about an ethnic community. At its center, instead, was the free union of free individual people, we the people. In 1933, my family had left the worst people's community that ever existed, the Germany under National Socialism, and had emigrated from Europe to the USA in time before the eruption of the Second World War. A few years later, they became American citizens. Towards the end of the Second World War, their political conviction was slowly transformed to me more and more consciously. My grandparents' house was host to many co-emigres, writers and musicians. Early on, I could sense their consternation at the perversions of human rights and the great cultural tradition of their abandoned homeland. I myself had always been filled with a proud sense of community at the primary school at Mid Valley, San Francisco, where my parents lived, when my class had to sing the national anthem every morning before school started. We were standing en bloc before the more than head-high American flag next to the teacher's desk, boys saluting girls with their right hand on their hearts. Democracy, for us Americans constitutionally established, was for me from the beginning the emblem of civil autonomy. It stood for freedom of opinion and co-determination on the basis of a fundamentally equal status for all people. As an adult, I understand this social, political, and legal signification increasingly as an expression of an even deeper conviction. It is based on the philosophy of enlightenment and our Jewish-Christian concept of humanity. It was the basic understanding of an indiscriminate equivalence of all humans. For that reason, the concept of democracy remains first and foremost sustained by the awareness of human dignity. This is also how it was put in 1938 in the passionate address to the American people by author and Nobel Prize Literature laureate Thomas Mann, with the title, The Coming Victory of Democracy. There he writes, We must define democracy as that form of government and society which is inspired above every other with a feeling and consciousness of the dignity of man. It is reminiscent of the great American thinker and poet Walt Whitman, whom Thomas Mann studied intensively. One of the most important statements of Whitman was, "For I say at the core of democracy, finally, is the religious element. All the religions, old and new, are there." Or elsewhere he says, "And topping democracy, this most alluring record that it alone can bind and ever seeks to bind all nations, all men of however various and distant lands into a brotherhood, a family." Thomas Mann penned his speech, The Coming Victory of Democracy, in the spirit of his contemporary political and humanist role model, American's President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he never tired of presenting his speech on a lecture tour from coast to coast, lasting several months. For Thomas Mann, this democratic conviction was not too innate. Especially during World War I, he still drew a clear line between himself, a committed monarchist with nationalistic notes, and the Western democracies. But this changed after the end of monarchy. Already in 1922, in his speech von Deutsche Republik, the German Republic, he pledged himself to the new governmental structure and found it in the formula for democracy: the state has become the concern of all of us. We are the state. Soon Thomas Mann had to watch powerlessly how the first attempt of democracy in Germany, the Weimar Republic, slowly fell apart and eventually plummeted into National Socialism. In America, he began a rhetorical campaign for democracy in the 1930s, while still at Princeton, in which he considered which political system was most suitable for contemporary humanity. It is likely that his personal encounters with President Roosevelt at the White House, which made a great impression on him, contributed to this. From the Californian Pacific Palisades, Los Angeles, Thomas Mann addressed his fellow Germans between 1940 and 1945 over the air through the emphatic 55 radio speeches, Listen Germany, Deutsche Hörer. In them, he implored them again and again to renounce Nazi barbarism. Soon after Roosevelt's death, the hysteria of the McCarthy era emerged in America. The shock for my parents and grandparents was the deeper. The entire country was increasingly ruled by a fear of an agitation against communists, by enemy stereotypes, by suspicions, interrogations, and arrests. Fundamental civil rights were being restricted. In retrospect, this was my first example of how vulnerable and unstable the still very young life form of democracy was, even in its Western birthplace, America. My family suffered so greatly from these incisive changes that they were more and more distanced from the USA. It is from this period that the sentence by my uncle Klaus Mann originates, written shortly before his death: "Oh, America, my dreamland, my lost dream." I relocated back to Europe with my parents in 1949. 3 years later, my grandparents followed. But my early impressions could not end my glowing American patriotism. I was, as an American by birth, still too inspired by our heroic victory over Nazi Germany to understand the scopes of McCarthyism. The sudden geographical separation from the US felt at all the worst for me As a 9-year-old, for many years I suffered from strong homesickness, longing for my lost childhood paradise. Shortly before the end of the Obama era in November 2016, the German federal government was able, under the initiative of then Foreign Minister and now Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, to buy, for quite a significant sum, the former home of my grandparents, Thomas and Katja Mann, in California. The White House of Exile, as the federal president calls the house, has since been fundamentally renovated and transformed into a transatlantic center for encounter and dialogue. As such, it is meant to be a symbol for what it was in the times of Thomas Mann, a space of resistance against dictatorship and totalitarianism, and simultaneously a center for intercontinental exchange for the consolidation of a humane democratic peace. On the other hand, it is also meant to be an effective sign against the current drifting apart of the transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe. The acquisition of the new use of the house are intended to be an expression of Germany's respect for the great tradition of American democracy. From within it speaks the wish to stand with the US in their current crisis. The new use of the house is in this sense to be understood as a small greeting of hope and a gift from Germany to the US. After all, Germany primarily has the USA to thank for the slow and steady construction of its now relatively solid democracy after its necessary restart in 1945. This is why the house was also planned to be a place of remembrance of the great preceding epochs of democracy in the United States. In a way, it is also dedicated to the proud leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, and émigré Thomas Mann's American contemporary Franklin Delano Roosevelt. For me personally, the purchase of the house makes apparent the stark difference between Germany today and that of 1945, whose condition I witnessed succinctly from this very house. Who in this house would have even dreamt back then, when Germany lay in ashes, that in 2016 a German government would rescue and buy the house, Thomas Mann's home in Exile, and make it into a site for the protection and fortification of democracy and peace? In this sense, the German federal president Frank-Walter Steinmeier let us know his intentions with a quotation which he wrote especially for all of you here today in this conference. Atlanticism, he says, Atlanticism was an American creation that saved and protected Europe in unprecedented circumstances. In the currently unfolding global competition, which will depend on Europe to keep Atlanticism alive in the vital interest of both Europe and the United States. Atlanticism will require political wisdom on both sides, irrespective of moments of discord and even rivalry. It will also require a dialogue that enriches people on both sides. We must not become strangers in each other's eyes. Against this background, it was never the intention of the German federal government to use this house only as a memorial to Thomas Mann's literary and political work. Rather, its purpose is to serve as a space of transatlantic dialogue in regards to the future of democracy. And this transatlantic dialogue is not only designed to strengthen the vital solidarity between American and European continent, it is also expected to help break through the speechlessness of today's deeply fractured American society where fear and despair have robbed many people of the courage and power to feel a sense of community and to live together in solidarity. I am thinking there also about the two traditional political parties in the USA, which in my opinion definitely have to move towards a stronger constructive dialogue with one another than is currently the case. Parties in a democratic country are by definition in competition with one another, but this competition has to remain fair and should not derail into polarizing or even hostile fronts or icy silence. The practice that started at the Thomas Mann House in 2018 has begun to prove that this alternative White House, to pick up a term coined by my friend and co-fellow Heinrich Detering, can be a place of encounter in the widest sense. The invited fellows from Germany, who stay for a few months, are not there for their self-realization as artists or researchers. The reason for their stay is a dialogical exchange through daily togetherness, both with one another and with their American colleagues. Those American counterparts to the fellows from Germany are not only residents of Los Angeles and California. They come from anywhere on the American continent. They exchange concepts and ideas, communicate, discuss, disagree, and stimulate. It is about friendships and partnerships, joint trips to conferences or cultural or political institutions from coast to coast. They give talks or hold panel discussions or seminars. They support each other at eye level in the spirit of a transatlantic pluralism of ideas and beliefs. The core idea of this attempted dialogical togetherness is brought to the point with a quote by Jewish philosopher Martin Buber from his programmatic religious text originating from Jewish and Christian mysticism, I and Thou, where is written, all real living is encounter. This means that the identity of the human being never stems solely from itself, but always needs to be viewed in relation to its environment. Only the relation to a human other, the thou, or to the material world of it, make possible a certain demarcation of the I from its life world. Individuality can only be experienced in relationality. Dialogues change us. This is why they should not be primarily oriented towards a definable goal, but remain naturally open. Charles Taylor, a leading American proponent of the political philosophy of communitarianism, expresses this similarly. He says, discovering my own identity doesn't mean that I work it out in isolation, but that I negotiate it through dialogue, partly overt, partly internal, with others. The German fellows at the Thomas Mann House are selected by a committee in Germany, but their dialogue partners can, in theory, be any American. All of you, ladies and gentlemen, can join, because the more dialogue partners spread evenly throughout the USA a fellow can exchange with, the better, more intensive, lively, and diverse will the forms of transatlantic dialogue be. This fortunate project has brought me home in a dual sense. In one way, back to the newly dressed home of my grandparents from my American childhood, and on the other hand, back to the long dormant political involvement in the concerns of American politics. Especially now I see myself as an American citizen, democratically shaped by my family. Additionally, the generous decision of the German government to bring this project into existence has retroactively encouraged me in my decision to consciously accept German citizenship, almost 60 years after the war. In this way, I am now also doing my part as a German in this transatlantic project. In Germany, from time to time, I am asked whether I see a real chance for a transatlantic dialogue between Germany and the US in times where the administration in Washington questions transatlantic partnerships. Not to mention that democracy is not looking particularly good in Europe either, and that Europe itself is on the verge of disintegration sometimes. And I also often hear that as a result of its progressing weakening and reallocation, the now ancient NATO alliance is finally overdue to be replaced by new coalitions. In this context, Russia and China are often mentioned. It may be that some slow changes in this regard have become discernible, but I think it would be futile to already attempt a prognosis. And it seems to me especially futile to speak of an end of the transatlantic alliance, not to mention that I do not take a German involvement into a Russian or Chinese power sphere as a particularly attractive prospect. Germany and the US have a tightly joined history since 1945. It consisted for a long time of a conjoined economic and political bloc against the Eastern Hemisphere. However, the most important thing that the slowly rebuilt post-war West Germany has learned from the US, the birthplace of Western democracy, has been to finally construct its own increasingly stable parliamentary democracy. That this most humane and dignified of societal forms has now become endangered on both continents through accelerating technological and socio-political changes is no reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's even less reasonable to prematurely engage in new coalitions with states or communities of states whose cultural and political structures are still miles away from a liberal democracy based on the belief in the freedom and autonomy and dignity of its citizens. America's democracy, tried and tested, may well be at a particularly tense moment, but this is no reason to declare all of the US terminated with it. I remember similar predictions from my Aunt Erika already in the late 40s. Back then, Erika Mann was an even more exposed target for McCarthy's witch hunt than her father, Thomas Mann. Then, and also later, she would grate on my 12-year-old ears with her prophecy of doom that America was heading towards a swift demise. She compared it, to me, to the downfall of the Roman Empire 1,500 years earlier. If this prophecy had any truth in it, perhaps an American democracy would never have even taken off after the murderous witch trials of Salem in Massachusetts in 1692, or it would have been finished in 1865 without the rescuing initiative of Abraham Lincoln, who repealed the division of the US into southern and northern states. And even the fascistic-like McCarthy era did not turn out to be the end point of American democracy for good reason. In his speech, Struggle for Democracy, on occasion of the inauguration of the Thomas Mann House at the Getty Center in Los Angeles on June 19, 2018, Federal President Steinmeier underscored the necessity for the enduring struggle not only for the preservation of democracy, but also its continual renewal. Because part of human freedom is to be susceptible to weaknesses, predispositions and temptations which can hinder the development of democracy and which need to be again and again corrected. This is why democracy is never self-evident. Its course is normally marked by alternating highs and lows. Thus, we, co-responsible for the preservation of democracy, need to remain alert. This alertness is aimed mainly at the principal enemies of every democracy: programmatic irrationalism and populism, fundamentalism and extremism. And so we have to keep an eye on these dangers also in Germany and in Europe, so that democracy there does not plummet into a disaster as it did at the time of the Weimar Republic. Democracy is continually in need of renewal. Everyone who commits their creative ideas to its preservation and renewal can take part in ensuring that democracy also remains able to renew itself. Democracy only has a future in this way, but it remains consistent with human nature, fragile and uncertain. The fragility of democracy is not only due to the flaws of its constituents. The system of democracy also demands constant adjustment to the changing times. Special consideration has to be given to historical contexts based hostile to democracy. If, for example, our anachronistic system of the Electoral College, stemming back to the founding period, had by now been replaced by a more timely system, at least one of our presidents would not have been elected. Despite having to take our fate in our own hands, we, the people, we all share the responsibility of closing the gap between the rich and the poor in America, between city and country, between men and women, especially regarding their access to political positions. We have to make sure that the rights of all people, no matter the color of their skin or ethnic, religious, or cultural background, are not just codified on paper in our Constitution. They also have to be realized and secured in practice. A precondition for the reduction of the power imbalance between privileged and underprivileged, and for the removal of cliquishness between beneficiaries, is to reduce communicative barriers between the two. For this, it is important to encourage potential conversation partners tirelessly to develop confidence-building dialogical communication. This, in turn, necessitates a fostering of the ability and willingness for dialogue also in the school and educational system. It is almost proof of the feeling of responsibility of many of our citizens that there is a growing protest culture of people from all social strata and ethnic groups. But what impresses me most is the strident and nonviolent way in which even children and teenagers make themselves heard. For example, survivors of the recent multiple school massacres in the US, which could have easily been prevented with stricter gun legislation, have paid visits to the White House in great numbers. There they expressed their despair and sorrow for the loss of their classmates and their fear of further attacks. And they demanded, albeit thus far without success, a change in course of the gun lobby, which shares evidently responsibility for the serial killings. This courageous initiative has activated their peers all over the world for the so-called Fridays for Future. It is a student protest movement during school hours every Friday morning against climate change, initiated by a Swedish student that has spread like wildfire everywhere, including also the USA. In conclusion, I want to hone in on the deeper levels of interpersonal dialogue and within the human consciousness and human will in general. Because in these depths lie our powers which strive for a self-determination, autonomy and freedom, the preconditions of every democracy. However, the mental capacities gifted to us for this do not simply fall into our lap. We have to slowly acquire them by working on ourselves step by step. This is why I bring up the practice of experiential dialogue, as I call it, the experiential dialogue, which might, in my opinion, play an important part in transatlantic dialogue. This experiential dialogue is a special form of dialogue which is practiced between all religions and all kinds of worldviews, the pluralism of which is particularly strong in the US. What is significant about experiential dialogue is that it exceeds any theological or philosophical discourse to also include the silence of meditation and contemplation and a communal spiritual practice. It originally describes dialogues between ordained clerics, nuns and monks from all global religions. Its special practice, deriving from the vaults of the oldest religious cultural traditions, is a process led more by the heart than the head. It enables a deep insight into the understanding of one's own religious or also non-religious roots, and thus strengthens the perception and opening of one's inner identity. On the other hand, it fosters mutual understanding and values the spiritual or also non-spiritual world of the other within the accepted multiplicity of faiths through a prejudice-free, respectful and empathic understanding. Through this authentic and relational exchange, the participants can also check the flexibility and malleability of their own inner identity. This constructive synergy of self and us leads to a particular intensity and depth of shared dialogical experience. Let me tell you about an impressive experience as an example. Recently, I participated in a discussion in Berlin, moderated by the German federal president, with a journalist, a theological sociologist, and an Islamic theology scholar about the relationship between religion and democracy. Thus, this, in my eyes, particularly authentic and relational exchange between controversial positions sounded to me like an experiential dialogue, transposed onto a scientific, theological, and political level. Personal positions were expressed authentically and transparently and progressively deepened, and the concerns of the participants were empathically and appreciatively received and further interrogated. Because it was not a spiritual exchange of experience between ordained clerics, but a factual discussion between experts of different fields, the personal religious identity of the participants and the moderator were never explicitly addressed, but it was clearly implicit within all contributions. During the course of the conversation, it became more and more clear to me that I would wish the transatlantic dialogues between fellows and counterparts at the Thomas Mann House and elsewhere to take the same form. I even see an example in it for dialogue all over the US, through which we could cultivate a stronger community and thus overcome a climate of alienation, competition, and a dog-eats-dog mentality. After all, as I said, and as Buber says, all real living is encountered. In this sense, following my last example, I would like to pose this question. How far could the central principles of interspiritual experiential dialogue be integrated into the more or less factual, even controversial political, scientific and cultural debates in our countries? Countless experts entrusted with difficult tasks, politicians, unionists, negotiators, seem to be keenly aware that that is a beneficial to precede an anxiously anticipated discussion or situation with a particular inner attunement, a kind of meditative pause or step back into oneself in silence. So I occasionally hear from state officials endowed with charismatic leadership skills that in the event of a public announcement of an important decision, they withdraw in silence for half an hour or so before stepping in front of a microphone, and they generally tend to prepare themselves in this way for delicate and decisive negotiations. It is also known that the more people are consolidated in themselves and calm in this fashion, the more they will be ready to engage with an opponent or conflicting party, and to take them seriously as an adequate dialogue partner. This way, through an empathetically understanding attitude, they can arrive slowly, very slowly, at a realization of common goals and attempts to solve problems conjointly. This long-term process will, over time, more and more effectively replace irreconcilable opinions in categories in victory and defeat with conciliation, convergence, and complementation and balance. I think that the most apparent political application of the basic principles of experiential dialogue is diplomacy. Long-time German ambassador in London and Washington, Peter Ammon, said in a recent interview that good diplomacy first, he says three things. First, requires a readiness for self-critique. Second, that diplomacy is never a one-man show, but can only be successful through togetherness. And third, which is very important also, that it requires at least a minimal basis of trust toward your collocutor. Dialogue in interpersonal, international, and intercultural areas is, corresponding to our human complexity, a multifaceted, diversely colorful, and highly interesting subject. Ability for dialogue is an irreplaceable condition for our unanimous living together. It is a mental breeding ground for every democracy. And if we assume that democracy, especially in the USA, is most adequate for our modern conception of the humanity and most likely to guarantee a peaceful coexistence, then this dialogue is an expression of our ability to listen, to understand, and to verbalize, a symbol of human culture and dignity, and in particular a basis for the mental climate of democracy. Instead, in totalitarianism, the prefabricated dogma of an ideology equipped with sanctions is the brutal instrument of those in power to dominate their people. This ideology excludes dialogue, silences it, prohibits it, so that the totalitarian powers remain in control of the masses. But the basis for a peaceful democracy is dialogue. And the basis for a fruitful dialogue, in turn, is a consciousness bound to ethical values And this includes a striving for interpersonal communication and encounter. In this sense, it is of central importance to further develop a conversational culture that unites people and to attempt to realize constructive forms of communication and patterns of attitudes inspired by experiential dialogue. After all that I have said about the limits and risks, but also the value of democracy, I would like to quote one of the greatest politicians and staunchest defenders and savers of democracy from his famous speech on November 11th, 1947 in the House of Commons, Winston Churchill. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And to conclude with his master's voice in the coming victor of democracy, if we say truth, we also say freedom and justice. If we speak of freedom and justice, we mean truth. It is a complex of an indivisible kind, freighted with spirituality and an elementary dynamic force. We call it the absolute. Thank you for listening.
We have some time for discussion.
Hi.
Hear me? Yeah.
Thanks, Ellis Schrockman, Department of German Studies. I was just curious to know, the extremes of populism that we've seen recently in this country seem to be the result of incurable ignorance and the uneducatability of a large share of the population. Does that shake your faith in democracy, or do you see some way to get around that? Oh, I'm sorry, do you see some way to avoid that? Or is there some way to get around this ignorance and uneducatability of at least 40% of the electorate?
Yeah. I would say that also, therefore, dialogue is important to educate people who are just ignorant. I mean, I know that, for instance, as an example, New York City. In New York City, I think most people are voting blue. But you just have to go to the next village. The countryside changes. So it really is a problem of non-conscious what is really important. Well, I mean, one should really, and in this, if, for instance, I still hope they might, the Democrats might get somebody who's really represented for the party, which is not, seems not to be now the case, but that they would step out and really would then try to aufklären, enlighten the people as much as it is possible, really, and stem them away from fake news, which comes from other parts. And this fake news is the most danger, the really most danger.
I pose this question because it sounds like what you're describing is a dialogue among enlightened, educated people who, you know, might as well be sipping tea and listening to string quartets. How do you reach the other people?
Before, I think it is very important that people who have the same opinion, that they step together, but not only to talk with each other, but also to make a group, or also some really as big as possible a network, even from in each parts, to communicate with each other, and then to talk and to try to talk with people who are a little farther away for instance, let's say in the Rust Belt, which is very poor, and where people, I think, I know how many percent were voting Republican last time. So that's what I would say about this. But there were now other, I don't know which. Okay. I thought I saw some, but it's not that. Okay.
Should I mean, I can follow up on this. Actually, oh, yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. I was curious, every once in a while there was a reference to spirituality, the Jewish Christian tradition, a concept of humanity, and then at the end spirituality came back. And often it seems like discussions based on dialogue would be more focused on secularism. So I was just interested if you had some further thoughts on the role of religion in these discussions.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both. It's religion and non-religion sometimes has a very thin borderline. And for instance, if I think that the Catholic monks in the medieval, that when they had learned very, very much from the antique, which was covered off during the Völkerwanderung, one says, the in the early 2nd century. And but they rescued the antique culture, and then they brought it up again because there are similarities between the religious encountering in the monasteries with the antique Socraterian and Platonian dialogue. I think it's all the ancient Asian tradition of Buddhism and even the older than Buddhism or even Hinduism is also very similar, and that's why many I know monasteries have from Benedictines especially, who have a very strong connection with Buddhists, and they found many common things. And that's very important. And then to see that the differences between religions is not really based on religion, but it's based on the culture. The people often see that the differences come from the roots. They come from their culture, the different cultures, but they all want the same. Even many times also religious and non-religious people, sometimes they discover that there are some parts, and these are the important parts, the ethics, for instance. Dalai Lama once said, ethic is more important than religion. But even himself, the leader of the Buddhism. But for him, ethics is not a rule. It's not a sum of rules. Ethic is really something experiential. And then he says, in this sense, it is better and more important than these religions have some rigid institutionalization which you can't follow anymore, or many people can't follow anymore. Fundamentalism and so on. Okay. So yeah, no. When you say that, when you this light, I think he's okay. Who was now? Six. Oh, there. Yeah.
Thank you. I was very intrigued by your inclusion of Harriet Tubman in your list of American figures who might serve or who might have influenced Thomas Mann or service models for us. I actually assume that Harriet Tubman is your edition, or do you have any evidence that Thomas Mann even knew of her or took an interest in her? And the slightly perhaps larger and more important question to build on that is, what would you say to people? I mean, you don't have to convince us about the significance of Thomas Mann, obviously you're preaching to the converted here, but what would you say to people from various backgrounds, various ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, who maybe, are not naturally drawn to Thomas Mann, who see in him a white, older male, patrician kind of figure, and who ask, why should this person of all people be your model for a dialogue?
Because Thomas Mann changed so much when he came to the United States. And even in 1922, when he wrote the Von Deutscher Republik, it was very hesitating. It was a beginning. He read Walt Whitman, but he read it in the German, not in the original. And in the 30s, when he's in the late 30s, after 1934, I think it was the first time in America, it was 4 times, until he was then really emigrated to Princeton, he really changed. And I also know other members of the family who changed quite much through being in America in the 40s and 50s. It is a country where we have another way of communicating, and I think he was not only theoretical and politically, but also in all-day life. He had another opinion about democracy. He was losing somehow his old patriarchalism of Lübeck. Of course, he sometimes also, towards me, he was talking about his father sometimes, how proud he was and so, but still, he changed very much. And for instance, he told me once a story when he was, I think it was in his lecture tour, he was going by train, and then he went to the dining car, and there he listened, and then another man came and said, "Oh, hi, I'm George," and then he said, "Oh, I'm Tom." And then and they were conversating very nice, and then the other one was taking his photos. Was my wife, and these my children. He didn't have any photos. Maybe next time then. So this is very. It was typical. He could somehow. What I said, angleichen. Yeah. So it was really, and that's why he was so awful hurt when he saw that it was in October, it was in fall '47 when he had his first very happy traveling to Europe after the war, and he came. And it was a beautiful summer. He had lectures in Switzerland and London, and not in other countries. And then we came back, and in October it happened. It just whoops! Then it was for years and years, and this was a real a bad shifting. Then being forced to go back, not in the country, but in the continent from which he had escaped from Nazism, and when he was there, he still was homesick to California again. So it was a really so that's why this is. I think this is a sign how much it changed. It really changed. Mm-hmm. Somebody else? Yeah.
Hello. So in my class, we read the Coming Victory of Democracy, in which Thomas Mann talks about how young people are more attracted to like other political movements because they're more exciting or they bring a sense of novelty. So what is your opinion on that, and maybe how do you think democracy can bring a sense, how can democracy bring this renewal in a way that will like excite young people?
I think that there's a great difference between the young people then and now, because dictatorship and ideologies were attractive for many left and also more, even more right. And but this today we, as I said in the beginning, that the young people, they're getting very critical, and they are very aware of things. Grown-ups, old people don't want to know anymore because they have so experienced many bad things. But they're still, let's say, I don't know. Anyway, they have a strong. This is also very, very, very important that they don't go isolated or in small groups, but really in big groups. That's what I think could be a very important model also for us grown-ups, not only to communicate with a few people, but really makes great grand groups. And so, as I said, I have some when I'm just now went through the United States. I had opportunities before I was here in high schools and in universities, in colleges, and here especially. And I'm coming home enriched by the experience I have done. I can't do any prophecy. I don't know how really it will work, but it's a hope. And I think to have any hope today is the most important, because it's very dangerous where we are living in all continents. Okay.
Thank you very much for your talk. There was a BBC broadcast a few years ago about Thomas Mann in America. It began with Thomas Mann speaking, and I think I can reproduce those sentences. They made a strong impression. He said, "I have not much faith. I have not much faith in faith. I have faith in goodness, which can also be the source of art." You probably know this quotation. Now here's my question. Art and democracy, a kind of propaganda, a propagandistic art to reach the uneducated. Mann speaks more than once in various talks in America in the 30s about the necessity of a propaganda on behalf of democracy. He just now spoke about goodness as a source of art. A kind of, right, a new sort of social democratic realism that might conceivably reach that group that Ellis has spoken of. Because rational dialogue or secular dialogue reaches a quick end. But a kind of theater, if you could think of young people devoting themselves to a sort of liberal democratic socialist, as Mann would speak of a liberal socialist democracy, a theater to reach those who are not moved by ordinary conversation.
Of course, art you can do in a positive and a negative way. That's true. And he meant the positive way. You know, I'm still quite surprised that these young people. I was somehow before I got aware that how many people got in a good way, for a good reason, on the street. About their people, that many have just when they stick the whole day with their computer, and I was getting pessimistic. What's not happening? And many things are happening, but I think it's sometimes in my age, at least, it's often I have to then get aware that I'm misunderstanding them. I have maybe a wrong perception of them. But what they are doing now when they talk, even if many of these children have a very restrictive, a very small knowledge, but what they say is right, and they can learn and learn more and more. And that's why I have since a few years, my faith for them is growing. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm thinking I'm now going this trial. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. If I may suggest, and this is an answer to the question that was raised before, why should Thomas Mann be the model? Just read some of his fiction. Pick up Mario and the Magician, and you'll know why Thomas Mann is a good advocate for democracy. That story tells about how a hypnotic, charismatic individual subdues the will of an audience in Italy. It's fascist Italy, not fascist Germany yet. And when you see how he takes that apart, that's an indirect argument for democracy. So you don't always have to look for democracy. See what he does in his fiction, not his nonfiction, but his fiction, and you'll get the message.
Thank you so much, and I really liked your concept about the experiential dialogue. And perhaps you could just share a little bit your experiences with the students, because I know you toured a lot of high schools and universities. So just your experiences from the dialogues that you had with the Americans, and what was different perhaps from dialogues that you would have with German students or German pupils. Yeah.
a nice experience was I have twice. Once it was in the California State University in Long Beach, and here there were twice. Students asked me the same question after my lecture, the same one, and they asked me, how can one learn experiential dialogue? And I could both give the same answer, because in the first group it was so big, I just could do it very slow, very quick. But the group here was a smaller unity of students, and there I could do it a little more. And I said, experiential dialogue is no technique. You cannot train it. It's a habit, or it's a what do you say? Einstellung. It's an attitude. It's an attitude, and it's an attitude you cannot just switch in and have it. That's now my attitude. It has to be learned very slowly by, as I told, by trying to meditate. It's not so hard to contemplate. And of course there are possibilities to get a fortification in it when you use these many, also from far Asia coming things like yoga, or there's another method too. It's called which is very common, but it can be also very surface. I mean, very without any depths. And I told you, if you really want to know it, what this is, maybe you go sometimes into a monastery and just talk with a monk or a nun, and ask her, what is this, and what is contemplation, and show me something. And I think this is the best way to begin. It's only beginning, of course, and then to step slowly into it, or just listen how it's also a possibility how monks and nuns from different religions they talk with it, or how they meditate, or how they read, or these things. And it's a slow process. It's a training. It is a training, but it's in another way a training. So I think this is just something to have. One has to say it's a slow motion. It's not something we can do it quick, like learning a computer or learning something. It's really slow, and that's the only thing what I can say. Just learn. Go to people who know about that. Okay.
I did actually want to just to comment on, I mean, you talked a lot about the situation here in the US and Trump, but we haven't really talked about the situation in Germany. And I think you have a different perception of what is going on in Germany and what is going on in the US. I wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that both, that the most important thing is both have an absolute different background, different history. The American democracy is 250 years old, and has made some tests. Right, they ran through, and they got up again. We don't know what's going to happen now in the next years. We don't know this. We only can hope. But I have some confidence that in the long term, because of the long background, there is quite a hope that that in America things will get fixed in such a big land with so many people and so many different places, and also resources they have. In Europe is small. Europe has a democracy. The most countries not more than 100 years, 70 years in Germany. In England, that's the oldest one, because America has learned, of course, from England. Even if they have a king, but in Europe, Europe is small. Europe has very, very different nations with a very different cultures, with a very different history. Having had wars with one another, against one through decades, through centuries even, going 1,000 years, and now they are exposed to that giant flow of refugees from big continents. And I'm a little worried in the long term that they will stand it. Maybe they can, but for this. I think in Europe, despite of dangerous movements, right-wing movements in some countries, also in Germany, the AfD is in the countryside of East Germany is dangerous. And we also had this situation where we didn't know how will the Dutch people vote, how will the French vote, and they did vote in a rational, in a good way. In Italy, some shiftings had been positive. I was more pessimistic half a year ago. Austria had a good voting, Switzerland too. So and the green movement, and the children again, the youngsters. So I'm not sure. I'm very open. I don't know what's going on. There are positive and negative things. I'm a little worried, but then with a lesson, it's changing always, and we will see. I mean, both continents are very, very different, and that's why I think they should learn from each other more. They should have a really strong relationship with each other, so they can learn with each other to also to consolidate with each other to together struggle for democracy.
Perfect closing sentence. So I'm going to break here, and we can continue the discussion over the reception outside of the lecture hall. So thank you very much for your talk and the discussion.